welcome. You've found your way to a quiet space, one where history moves slowly and the noise of the present gently fades behind you. Tonight we leave behind the clashing swords, the roaring seas, and the legends of blood and thunder. Instead, we step into the cold mud of a quiet Viking homestead. Not as a warrior, not as a raider, but as a farmer. A man or woman who never sailed west, never saw a monastery, and never made it into the sagas. They woke early, worked late, feared the snow more than the sword, and carried on through days of hunger, wind, and aching joints. This is not the Viking story that fills movie screens. It is the slower, truer story, told not with battles but with hoarse voices, tired hands, and silent prayers to unseen gods. As always, if this story helps you relax or drift into sleep, consider liking and subscribing. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and what time it is. Now breathe slowly. Let the weight of the day fall away, and picture yourself beneath a low thatched roof as morning frost clings to the ground. Our journey begins there. You never saw the sea, never held a sword, and every morning smelled like wet wool and pig breath. You weren't a raider. You didn't sail off to distant shores or shout battle cries under iron skies. You were a farmer, one of thousands who never left the land, who spent their life in the slow rhythm of soil, frost, and sweat. And it was not a romantic life. Like waking in the cold, your day began before the light came. In a narrow wooden house packed with people, livestock, smoke, and sour air, there were no separate rooms. You slept on straw. You shared your sleeping space with goats in winter, because they kept the room warm and the walls were too thin. The air reeked of dung and damp wool. The fire had gone out. Your boots were stiff with frost. Food that wasn't breakfast wasn't much. A crust of coarse rye bread. Maybe some cold porridge if any was left. On a good day, you had a lump of cheese or dried fish. On a bad day, you chewed roots. Everything came from what you could grow, trap, or preserve. No store, no fallback. If the crop failed, you did without. Endless labor. You didn't just grow food. You had to. Spring meant digging trenches with wooden plows. Summer meant hay cutting and sheep shearing. Autumn meant slaughtering, salting, smoking. Winter meant mending tools and praying the stores lasted. You gathered seaweed, milked sheep, drove off wolves, patched holes in the roof, split firewood, scraped lichen off rocks for the animals to eat. Your hands were always cracked. Your back always sore. There was no retirement. Only slowing down for and being fed by younger hands if they were kind. The silent threat of weather. The greatest enemy wasn't war. It was weather. A single early frost could ruin the barley. A wet summer meant rot. A dry one, no hay. Winter was long and snow didn't mean magic, it meant hunger. You learned to eat less, to chew slower, to make broth from bones boiled 3 times. And if the wolves came too close, you didn't fight them. You just kept the door closed and hoped they left someone else hungrier. No glory, no songs, nobody sang songs about you. Your name wouldn't be carved into runestones. Your bones would be buried near the sheepfold. And yet without you, the raiders had no food. The kings had no taxes. The stories had no backdrop. You were the background of history. Essential, forgotten. And so now picture yourself stepping out into the chill morning air. A wooden bucket in hand, mud sucking at your boots as the sky grows pale. You are tired, but there are chores, and no one else to do them. This was the Viking world for most. You weren't a warrior, you weren't a king, but without you, the world stopped turning. In every Viking village, somewhere between the muddy fields and the smoky longhouse, there was a forge. Not grand, not glorious, but alive. A round pit of fire, clay and stone fed by hand and foot bellows. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't clean, but it was essential. You were the blacksmith. You didn't wield a sword, you shaped the sword, and you shaped nails, hinges, rivets, sickles, knives, plows, shears, and axe heads. You repaired iron that broke. You gave new life to tools worn down by earth and time. You were not rich, you were not powerful, but you were needed. Your forge was simple. A firebed, a battered anvil, a few precious tongs and hammers, all dark with soot. The anvil might have been a large stone or an old iron block. There were no walls, no roof unless you made one. Just the open air and the smoke. Each morning began early. The charcoal had to be prepared. You knelt in the damp grass, feeding the fire, pressing the bellows, waiting until the coals glowed like embers inside a beast. The metal would not forgive you if the fire was wrong. Too cool and it resisted, too hot and it cracked. You learned from someone older. Maybe your father. Maybe just a man whose own hands had curled from long use. You learned by watching, burning yourself, failing, starting over. The fire taught you as much as any man. Iron didn't give up its shape easily. It needed coaxing. Long heat, steady strikes, a rhythm in your arm. You worked while others farmed. You stayed when others raided. You kept the world functional. People brought you broken tools. You rarely asked for coin. Instead, they left fish, wool, eggs, or help splitting wood. A quiet barter. You didn't ask for praise, but some whispered that smiths were close to magic. After all, you bent earth with flame. But it wasn't romantic. The heat scalded your skin. Sparks landed in your hair, your clothes, your eyes. Your hands blistered, your back bent. The ringing of metal never left your ears. In winter, your fingers numbed. In summer, sweat soaked your tunic by noon. Sometimes you made weapons, a sayax, a spearhead, an arrow tip. But most of your iron became tools, not trophies. A blacksmith was a servant to the village's survival, not to its glory. At night, you returned home smelling of smoke and iron. Your arms ached, you ate in silence. The fire still glowed in your mind. In the dark, sometimes your hands moved in your sleep, still hammering. And yet you rose again, because the tools needed shaping, and someone had to hold the world together. The raiders sailed off into sagas. You stayed behind one and held the village together. Ursunim, if the Viking world had a spine, it wasn't iron or oak. It was a woman standing at the doorway of a longhouse, arms flour-dusted, eyes sharp, watching the weather and counting the days until winter. You were not idle. You didn't wait for a husband to return with silver. You managed the land, the food, the children, the livestock, and sometimes all at once. You knew the harvest by smell. You felt the coming frost in your bones. You kept life going when the men were gone and even when they never came back. Yes, labor endlessly, your hands were rarely still. You baked flatbread over an open flame, spun wool from sheep you helped shear, wove linen on a warp-weighted loom that creaked with each careful pass of your fingers. You made clothes, you dyed thread. You stitched tears, patched holes, rewound the spindle again and again. You weren't just the cook or the cleaner. You were the planner, deciding how much dried fish to ration, how much sour milk to risk, how to stretch 3 onions through 7 days. The world assumed you'd manage, you did. The motherhood without safety. You birthed children in smoky rooms, sometimes with help, often alone. The floor was straw. The pain was endured in silence. Not every birth was survived. You buried babies. You named new ones quickly. Names were cheap, but hope was priceless. You knew the herbs for fevers, the salves for burns, the prayer for when a child stopped breathing and there was nothing else left to do. Art when the men were gone. If your husband joined a raid, you didn't know when he'd return, or if he would. You kept the fire burning. You fixed the roof with neighbors. You settled disputes at the well. You held the home together with thread, patience, and salt. If he came back, you welcomed him with broth and silence. If he didn't, you went on. The quiet power Viking women had more rights than many of their medieval neighbors. You could own property. You could inherit. You could even divorce, but legal rights didn't lessen the work. You weren't a shield maiden. You didn't fight in furs under stormy skies. You scrubbed floors and soot-blackened pots with the same quiet strength that held generations upright. When at night you fell asleep by the hearth, blanket wrapped tight, listening for the baby's cough and the wind outside the door. You were tired but never done, because the morning always came, and there was bread to bake. The animals were not tools. They were lifelines, and when they faltered, so did everything else. You didn't have many animals, just enough. 2 sheep, perhaps 3, a few chickens, 1 stubborn cow or an ox if you were fortunate. They weren't pets, they were food, warmth, and survival. The sheep gave wool and milk, the chickens gave eggs. The cow pulled the plow and filled the pail. And you needed them all. A strange sound in the night, it often started with sound. A bleat too weak, a clucking that went silent. A cough from the cattle stall that didn't stop. You rose before the sun, stepping outside in the cold, only to find one of your sheep on its side, legs twitching in the straw. No blood, no wound, just something wrong. You tried the basics on fresh water, warmth, a mix of herbs. You whispered a quiet prayer, though you weren't sure to which god it belonged, and then you waited. When animals failed, so did you. The loss of a sheep wasn't just sad. It was disastrous. That wool was clothing. That milk was breakfast. That meat might have been your winter plan. There was no vet, no medicine. Only what you'd learned from your mother, and what the old woman 2 fields over might remember. You turned to barley mash, to elderflowers, to pine tar. Sometimes they worked, often they didn't. And if one animal died, you prayed it wouldn't spread. You had no understanding of germs. Only that illness moved in whispers from mouth to hoof to lung. Or the chicken that stopped laying. Some days it was smaller. The chicken that gave no eggs. The cow whose milk dried up. The ox that wouldn't rise. You couldn't afford to feed what gave nothing. But you also couldn't afford to lose them. And so you waited. You carried extra buckets. You checked more often, you hoped, because each animal had its own rhythm. And when that rhythm stopped, so did part of your day. Or the sky went quiet. When birds flew low or when the wind fell still, you felt it in your gut. A strange tension, as though the world were holding its breath. You watched the clouds more than you watched the road. You listened for the crunch of hooves, the rustle in the barn, the sound of something not being right. And when it all went quiet, too quiet, you knew something was coming. Illness. Famine. A hard frost that would kill half your feed. You couldn't fight the sky. But you learned to read it. Oh no, you the shepherd, you weren't a warrior, you weren't a king. You were just someone trying to keep a sheep alive through another bitter week. And when you failed, you buried it. You didn't cry, you just dug. Because the work was never done. Your house didn't need to impress. It just needed to hold. You didn't live in a stone hall with carvings and braziers. You didn't sleep under a roof of gold or slate. You lived in a turf-roofed longhouse. Low, dark, and practical. Built not for beauty, but to survive the weight of wind, rain, and snow. And even then it struggled. Or the roof above your head. Your roof was not made of tiles or shingles. It was sod. Layers of earth and grass laid over beams and thatch. It worked until it didn't. The first signs were soft. A drip near the hearth, a smell of mold. The sound of mice skittering where they didn't belong. You climbed up carefully, checking for gaps, soft spots, shifting weight. Patching meant hauling wet turf. Balancing on slick beams, tying it all back down with rope or bark cord. You hoped it held through the next storm. Because once it caved, nothing inside could be saved. The clay beneath you. Your walls were wattle and daub, woven sticks coated with clay and straw. They kept out the cold most of the time. But if the clay cracked, from wind, frost, or a careless bump from a goat, the draft returned. You'd mix more daub, pressing the clay in with your fingers, hoping it dried before the next rainfall. It always felt like you were patching a ship while still at sea. When a fire without a chimney smoke was a constant guest. Your hearth sat in the middle of the house, no chimney above it, just a smoke hole and hope that the wind pulled it out. On bad days, the smoke stayed low, curling into your eyes, your throat, your lungs. Children coughed, eyes watered. Food tasted of ash, still the fire stayed lit. It had to. Walls that listened, you learned to live close. One room living, your entire family and often your animals under the same roof. You heard every cough, every whisper, every shift in the straw. Privacy was rare, silence rarer still. The house was both shelter and trap. Warm in winter, stifling in summer, always too close. Night sounds. At night, the walls creaked. Rain tapped the roof like fingers. Mice chewed somewhere in the rafters. Wind whistled through gaps you'd thought were sealed. You lay in the dark, hoping the beams held. If the fire burned too low, the cold returned. If it burned too hot, it sparked. You never quite relaxed, and still you built. You didn't dream of castles. You dreamed of a house that didn't leak, of clay that held firm, of a roof that stayed on through the winter wind. And every year you rebuilt, patched, reinforced, not because it was glorious, but because it was home. You didn't need enemies, the sky itself was threat enough. You could do everything right. You could till the land carefully, plant on time, pray to the old gods and the new. You could weed, water, tend, and instill. A single storm could erase a season. You lived at the mercy of sky and soil, and the sky rarely asked permission. But when fire found the field, you didn't see it at first, only smelled it. Dry heat, smoke in the wind. You ran, not toward the fire, but toward the tools. A shovel, a bucket, anything. The barley field was gold and ready, but a stray spark, maybe from a neighbor's hearth or a lightning strike, could light the edges like paper. The fire ran faster than you, and once it jumped the dry grass, you knew it could take everything. You beat at the flames, you soaked the earth. Sometimes the whole village came. Sometimes it wasn't enough. The storms that lingered, you could feel it before it came. The sky would go still, birds would vanish. The wind would hold its breath. And then a distant rumble. thunder that rolled low like gods whispering over hills, a wall of gray rising fast. You had no weather reports, only instinct. You ran for the tools, covered the grain with linen, tied down the roof again. When the rain came, it wasn't gentle. It slapped the earth, flooded the fields, washed seeds into ditches. You waited inside, pacing, listening to every creak of the roof beams. Rush into the flood. When the storm passed, you stepped out into silence. The crops were bent, sometimes flat. The soil clung to your boots. Wheat turned to mush. Roots drowned. You stood in the middle of it, mud to your knees, trying not to think of winter. The storm didn't care that you'd worked since spring. Didn't care that your child was growing thin. It came and it left. And you started again. Hail and hunger. Sometimes the sky didn't bring rain. It brought ice. Small stones of hail dropping like teeth from a wolf's jaw. They shredded the green, crushed your late cabbage. Bruised apples not yet ripe. A week's food lost in 10 minutes. You gathered what you could and prayed the cellar had enough. At a constant calculation. Every day you scanned the horizon. You weren't looking for ships or swords. You were watching the clouds. Too gray, too still, too red at sunset. Each shade meant something. Each gust could shift your plans. You didn't fear war, you feared drought. And yet you planted because the land was all you had. And the sky, indifferent as it was still your only partner. So you bowed to it. You prayed with dirty hands and hoped for just enough sun, just enough rain, just enough time before the next fire. Food wasn't about taste, it was about not starving. Your kitchen was a hearth dug into the floor. There was no pantry, no spice rack, no bread oven with golden crusts. There was only what you could grow, catch, ferment, or save, and often it wasn't enough. Morning without luxury. Your day began with bread, and if you were lucky, a coarse flatbread made of barley or rye, dense, dark, slightly sour from age. You dipped it in thin buttermilk, perhaps sipped cold porridge made yesterday. No honey, no coffee, no fruit in season, unless you'd picked it the day before and hidden it from the children. Preserving everything you couldn't afford waste. Everything had to last. Meat was salted or smoked. Fish was dried on racks and strung in long loops in the rafters. Cabbages were buried or fermented in sour brine that stung the nose. You saved turnip tops, marrow bones, and the greenest parts of onions. You scraped the sides of bowls. You fed yesterday's scraps to tomorrow's stew, and you hoped it wouldn't spoil. Those midday hunger, by midday your stomach growled. You boiled grain with goat's milk, maybe added a strip of dried fish, salty, brittle, chewy. You sat near the hearth, eating from a shared pot. No forks, just wooden spoons. Children picked through the stew for something familiar. You scolded gently, but you understood. No one looked forward to eating it. They just didn't want to be hungry anymore. Feasts were rare. You heard tales of roasted boar, of mead-filled horns, of feasts in long halls. But for you, that was once a year, at most. A wedding, a good harvest, a birth. Then came the good food. Fresh meat, rich broth, sweet ale. You smiled, you laughed, and you prayed you wouldn't have to bury anyone before the next feast. Mama, when food ran out, sometimes it snowed too early. The harvest was weak. The cow stopped giving milk. You stretched everything thinner. You boiled old bones twice. You added moss to the bread. You let your own portion shrink so your child's could stretch. You found yourself chewing slowly, not to savor, but to forget how small the meal was. Food was a gamble. You picked mushrooms carefully, whispering to yourself the rhyme that helped tell safe from deadly. You inspected salted fish for green spots, sniffed the milk twice. You listened for illness, a rumbling stomach, a cough after stew. You weren't always right. The taste of survival. Most things tasted of salt, ash, and earth. The sweetness of berries or mead was rare, a brief moment when your mouth remembered joy. But food wasn't for joy. It was for warmth, it was for strength. It was for waking up the next day. You chewed slowly, swallowed silently, and thanked the gods that there was still something left to eat. Winter didn't knock, it came in and stayed. You didn't count winter by months. You counted it by firewood piles, by how many sacks of grain you had left, by how long the water bucket stayed frozen indoors. It came early, it stayed late, and when it arrived, it settled into your bones. Before the snow fell, you felt winter before you saw it. The sun hung lower. The wind shifted us to colder, sharper, like a blade pressed to the cheek. You moved faster in the fields, collected moss, sticks, anything that might burn, salted the last of the meat, checked the roofs again, When the frost came, it didn't whisper, it cracked. You woke to stiff fingers, to your breath hanging in the air above your own bed. Almond inside was no escape, you didn't have insulation. Your walls were earth and timber, your roof damp turf and old thatch. Inside you lit the hearth, but the heat stayed low, crawling on the floor. The cold clung to your knees. The smoke hung in the rafters. You huddled close to the fire, but not too close. Sparks could jump without warning. There was no silence. The wind howled through every gap you missed during repair. On a slower life, but not a gentler one. Winter changed the rhythm. Days were short, nights were long. You carved tools, you mended clothes. You spun wool slowly, knitting warmth into everything. You told stories to pass the hours. Not the grand ones, not always. Sometimes just a memory, a riddle, a song passed down from someone long buried. I was cold. That took things some winters the cow didn't survive. You heard her slow breathing at night, felt her growing still under the same roof. You watched the youngest child shiver in their sleep and doubled the blankets. You wrapped yourself in fur and linen, but your toes still burned from the chill. The bread hardened faster, the firewood burned too quick, and the cold never left the corners of the house. When hunger returned by midwinter, the cellars echoed. You scraped the bottom of the barrel. Turnips softened, grain grew weevils. You picked around them, you didn't complain. You simply ate less, and waited for the snow to recede from the fields. And yet you endured, you knew winter would leave. It always did, but each year it felt longer. Each year your joints ached earlier. Each year something or someone did not make it to spring. Still you woke, you fed the fire, you fed the family, and you waited for green to return, even if you were never warm again. The danger didn't ride in on a horse. It crept in through the cough. You feared raiders, yes, but sickness was your closest, most familiar enemy. It didn't roar, it whispered. A child's cough that didn't fade. A neighbor too tired to rise. A midwife too late with herbs. And by the time you noticed, it had already spread. On the unseen visitors. You didn't know what a virus was. You'd never heard the word bacteria, but you knew the signs: boils that swelled, fevers that took strength hour by hour, skin that flushed red, then turned pale. No one touched the sick without thought. And yet, you had no choice. You held your child. You wiped your husband's brow. You whispered prayers as they shook beneath wool blankets. Healers and hope. There was no doctor. You called the wise woman. She brought roots and leaves, ashes from sacred fires, whispers meant for gods. You brewed teas bitter as bark, wrapped cloth soaked in vinegar, placed warmed stones at cold feet, and still some did not rise. You didn't blame her, you didn't blame the gods. You simply waited for the next cough. No isolation, no escape. There was no separate room, no closed door. If one in your house fell ill, the rest followed. You slept on the same straw, shared the same bowls, breathed the same smoky air. You watched siblings grow silent. You watched the fire burn low because no one had strength to tend it. And in the quietest hours you listened to the rasp of breath, wondering if it would stop. Burials, without farewells. In summer, you dug graves in soft ground. In winter, the earth refused. You covered the body in cloth, waited for the frost to break, and kept a candle burning until then. There were no grand funerals, just songs murmured under breath. Hands joined in silence, a stone set where the soul had once stood. You didn't cry loudly, you couldn't. The living needed you. The fear that never left, even in good seasons, you feared the signs. A child with no appetite, a shaking hand, a red rash where skin should be clean. You watched, waited, measured life by heartbeats and breathing. You taught your children to endure, to hope, to eat garlic in the spring and keep away from those with sweat-soaked sheets. You learned to keep going. Sickness didn't stop the chores. Animals still needed feeding, bread still needed baking, fences still needed mending. You worked with worry beside you, with grief in your pocket, but you didn't stop, because to stop was to invite it in again. You survived with caution, not cure, with care, not certainty. And with every season you lived through, you whispered thanks, because the next might not be so kind. If it broke, you fixed it. If it didn't exist, you built it. You were not just a farmer. You were a blacksmith, a carpenter, a weaver, a builder of what you needed because no one else was going to make it for you. Every object in your home, every tool in your hand had once been raw and unshaped. And shaping it cost you time, effort, and often pain. The wood that held everything trees were more than shelter. They were your second livelihood. You knew which birch split cleanly, which oak bent without cracking, which ash burned hot and which pine smoked too thick. You carved handles for scythes, shaped buckets from hollow logs, sanded planks with rough stones until they didn't splinter. Your home stood because you built it. And each winter the snow reminded you what would happen if the roof failed. Thread-by-thread clothing wasn't fashion. It was survival. You spun wool by hand, sometimes for hours each day. Then came weaving, a rhythmic task, line after line on looms made of wood and patience. Dyes were rare, blues from woad, browns from bark, faded greens from nettles. Mostly clothes were the color of labor, gray, off-white, earth-brown. You patched until the patch became the fabric. You didn't throw away, you repurposed, always. The tools were earned, not bought. A metal knife was precious, a true iron axe even more. Sometimes you had to trade for it, with hides, fish, or favors. Other times you shaped a crude blade yourself, heating iron in a shallow forge, pumping bellows with one arm, hammering with the other. Your hands blistered, your shoulders ached, but when it was done you had something that would last years, maybe decades. If you took care of it, and everything had weight, even small things. A clay pot wasn't just a pot. It was a week's worth of drying, shaping, baking in a smoky kiln you built yourself. If it cracked, you patched it with pitch or threw it into the field for luck. A spoon wasn't just carved. It was a gift for a child, a spouse, a new home. A comb took hours from bone or wood. So did buttons, so did shoes. You noticed when things broke, because everything took something from you. You were always making. There was no idle season. In winter you wove nets, carved fishing hooks, shaped sled runners for the frozen roads. In spring you repaired fences, sharpened blades dulled by stone and time, sewed bags for carrying grain. You made, you remade, you repaired, and when something wore out for the final time, you sighed, but only for a moment. Then you started again. There were no police, only people who remembered who wronged them. There was no courtroom, no judge's bench, no gavel to strike order into the room. Your laws lived in the mouths of elders, passed from voice to voice, carried by memory, tradition, and fear. Justice was not written. It was spoken, remembered, and, when necessary, enforced by hand. The thing once or twice a year you traveled to a clearing, to a stone circle or a wind-swept hill where your village and its neighbors gathered. This was the thing, not a place, but a practice. A gathering where disputes were heard, where property was claimed, where blood debts were argued and marriages were pledged. The chieftain presided, but everyone listened, because everyone could be next. Where memory was the law book. There were no scrolls, no carved codes. You remembered what your father told you, how land passed through the family, what the punishment was for theft, who had once wronged your uncle, and what became of them. There were rules, but they were alive, changing, retold, sometimes forgotten, sometimes twisted to suit the strong. Justice began at home. If someone stole your goat, you didn't call a constable. You confronted them, you spoke with their kin. You might demand compensation, silver, cloth, or another goat. If they refused, you took your case to the thing. And if that failed, you settled it yourself. Not with violence at first, but with pressure, with neighbors, with whispered threats over cups of weak ale. But sometimes the blade came out before the words were done. Woody blood price murder wasn't met with prison. It was met with a vergild as a man's price, a set amount owed to the dead man's family. If you paid it, peace might return. If you didn't, vengeance followed. Feuds lasted years, sometimes generations. Children learned to avoid certain homes, to walk different paths, to remember names like warnings. Shame could be a sentence. There were no chains, but there was exile, dishonor, the sharp end of silence. You could be cast out, made a non-person, invisible, unwelcome. And in the North, to be alone was to be half-buried already. Still, it held together. For all its flaws, the system worked, in its own way. The law wasn't perfect, but it was shared. Respected more out of fear than fairness, but still, respected. You listened at the thing. You spoke when called. You paid your fines, made your oaths, and tried to live in a way that wouldn't require another hearing. Because you didn't want your name on someone else's tongue. The gods might bless you, curse you, or walk beside you, and so might the dead. Or you did not believe in luck. You believed in signs. A raven on the fence meant something. A dream you couldn't forget, and that meant more. A sudden silence in the woods, that meant you weren't alone. You lived with the gods, but also with those who had passed, and neither were far away. The gods were watching. Odin saw all. Freya whispered in love and grief. Thor stood between you and the storm. You didn't worship with sermons or scripture. You offered what you could: bread, bones, the first berries of summer. You whispered oaths into the wind, left carved sticks at the base of trees, and marked stones so they'd remember what you asked for. You didn't expect answers, but sometimes you got signs. But everyday rituals. You wore charms, a small hammer around your neck, a twist of thread for safe childbirth, a bone carved with runes only you understood. You greeted the morning sun. You spat before a hunt. You knocked on wood and turned your bread before baking. Each action had meaning. You didn't need to remember why. You just knew not to skip it. The dead were not gone. The dead were close, buried under your feet, under the earth that grew your food. Some rested well, others wandered. You left offerings at mounds. A coin, a crust of bread, a whisper. You spoke aloud in empty rooms just in case. A breeze through a closed window. A cold touch at the edge of sleep. A dream of someone gone. You didn't panic. You just said their name and lit a candle. On the land itself had spirits, the forest had eyes. The river had a voice. You didn't build where you weren't welcome. You didn't chop the wrong tree. You didn't fish the same spot too often. You left a fish on the shore for the river spirit. You tied ribbons in trees. You stepped carefully in the fog. It wasn't fear, it was respect. Because this land, your land, was older than you. And the sacred and the superstition blurred. You didn't ask, "Is this true?" You asked, "Will it help?" If your cow gave no milk, you hung herbs in the rafters. If your child had fever, you placed an iron nail beneath their bed. Not because you were foolish, but because you were surrounded by uncertainty. And certainty, even imagined, was a form of comfort. Luck, you believed. Because you needed to. When the storm came, when the baby cried all night, when the fire went out without reason, you reached for something beyond yourself. Not with desperation, but with quiet acceptance. Because the gods might listen, the dead might guard, the spirits might help. And because when the world was hard, belief was warmth where fire couldn't reach. You weren't raised, you were toughened. You didn't have a nursery. You had a dirt floor, a straw-stuffed blanket, and hands that were always busy. Your childhood wasn't made of toys or lessons. It was made of silence during adult talk, chores before sunup, and learning when not to speak. You were not protected, you were prepared. Yes, born into work. You were expected to help almost as soon as you could stand. At 4, you carried small buckets of water. At 6, you fed chickens and gathered kindling. By 8, your hands were calloused from tasks most modern adults might avoid. There was no day off, no gentle morning. You woke to the sound of scraping iron, coughing elders, and wind at the shutter. And you moved quickly, because that's what the grown-ups did, and you wanted to be counted among them. Their play was not separate play, looked like labor. You learned to swing a stick like a hoe, practiced scraping hide with stones, wove pretend ropes from grass. You copied the older children, and if you failed, you were corrected. Not punished, but reminded that play was preparation. Even games taught survival. Tag became chasing chickens. Catch became hauling firewood. And pretending to cook often meant you were handed a real knife. I know toys, but stories. Your toys were carved by someone in the family. A figure from bone, a boat from driftwood, a doll sewn from scraps. But the real toys were stories. Tales of gods and giants, of ancestors who swam across rivers in winter, who fought off wolves, who survived lean years with wit and silence. You listened not for fun, but for instruction. These were the blueprints of your future. And learning came by doing, no classrooms, no blackboards. You learned by watching, copying, failing. You learned how to twist rope, how to spot rot in stored grain, how to tell the time by the sun and the shape of the shadows. If you didn't learn quickly, you became a burden. And no one in a Viking household had time for burdens. Sickness took many. Not all your siblings made it. Some didn't live past the first winter. Some caught a fever and never stood again. Others grew too weak when food ran low. There were no goodbyes, no graves marked with names. Just stones, a memory, and a whispered name on cold nights. And still you laughed, you found joy where you could. In the warmth of a shared blanket. In the smell of fresh-baked bread. In the rhythm of a story told for the 50th time. You chased chickens and wrestled in straw. You made whistles from twigs. You learned riddles and rhymes you would carry into adulthood. Even in hardship, childhood still held moments of lightness. You didn't know comfort, but you knew togetherness, and that, more than anything, kept you strong. Love was not required, a good harvest was. You didn't marry for affection. You married for timber, for land, for a cow, or to seal a peace between households. A wedding was not the end of a love story. It was the beginning of new work. Marriage was not about happiness, it was about stability. Two sets of hands, bound by oaths, joined to survive the long winters ahead. Now, the bargain of union your family chose for you. You might have known the person, you might not. Either way, it was understood. You were old enough to contribute, to labor, to bear children, to keep a home. Your dowry might include wool, cattle, or tools. Their family brought promises, perhaps protection, a shared fishing right, or help mending fences in spring. The wedding was simple. Hands joined over a sword. Oaths whispered under a sky full of smoke. A feast if food was good that year. A smile, and if you were lucky. When love was not assumed, there might be affection. It could grow over time, through seasons of hardship and habit. But love wasn't expected. Respect was. You worked beside your spouse. You tilled, you mended, you gathered. At night, you shared warmth in a bed of straw. In the morning, you returned to your tasks. Your bond wasn't sealed with kisses. It was forged by repetition, by surviving the same storms. Children were the measure. Children were not just joy. They were labor, future heirs, proof that the marriage had purpose. Each child meant another mouth to feed, but also another body for the field, another mind to teach the rhythms of survival. You didn't talk of parenting strategies. You raised them by example, by watching, by doing. And when you lost a child, you mourned quietly, then turned back to the work, because the work never waited. A shared burden. You and your spouse divided everything. Firewood, food, fear. When the roof leaked, you both patched it. When the livestock fell ill, you both stayed up through the night. You argued, and of course, but quietly, with the weight of the household pressing down on both of you. There were no therapists, no love letters. Only wool to spin, grain to thresh, and silence shared by the fire. But fidelity was complex. Marriage didn't always mean exclusivity, especially for the men. A husband might travel, might take another woman elsewhere. It wasn't uncommon, nor always spoken about. Wives held power too, managing the home, sometimes holding the keys to the storeroom, the knowledge of herbs, the control of stories passed down through generations. And when a spouse died, life went on. You remarried not for love, but because winter was coming, and no one survived it alone. When the light faded, so did your hold on the world. You did not fight the dark. You respected it, feared it even, because when the sun fell behind the trees, your world shrank. The fire crackled, the hearth flickered, and everything beyond the door became shadow and silence and the unknown. Right to the ritual of closing. As twilight deepened, you moved through familiar motions. You doused the lamp with care, covered embers with ash to preserve them, latched the wooden door, tied the thatch curtain closed, not to block the wind, but to keep the dark from looking in. One last walk through the house, a check on the animals, a whispered goodnight to the spirits, just in case they listened better in the quiet. White night was not restful. Your sleep came in parts. First, a few hours of deep rest. Then you woke, not fully, but enough to add a log to the fire, check for sounds beyond the wall, stir and listen. The dark held strange sounds, creaking wood, a fox scream in the distance, wind slipping through thatch. Your dreams came in fragments. Not peaceful, not frightening, just heavy like stones gently shifting in your chest. Night was shared. The bed was narrow. Woolen blankets heavy. Your spouse, your children, all curled beside you, not from affection but from necessity. You shared heat. You shared breath. You shifted and sighed and tried not to wake the baby or the aching elder whose bones hurt most in the cold. The unknown pressed in. You didn't have candles to burn all night, just the fire's faint glow and the memory of light. Sometimes, when the wind howled loud enough, you remembered the old stories about things that walked after dark. Not wolves, not raiders, other things, older things. You didn't believe them. But still, you muttered a charm and kept the iron nail beneath your pillow, just in case. And then, the slow return. Eventually, your mind drifted. The fire dimmed, the house fell still. You didn't chase sleep, you waited for it. And it came, as it always did. carrying you across the dark until light returned. Another day ahead, more work, more weather, more life, and still you'd survived.